Hello, this is Derek from Bird's Eye View Media. Today I would like to talk about the movie Detroit, directed by Kathryn Bigelow, the same director as the woman who directed The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30, and those are two of my favorite recent films, so I was pretty excited to see the movie Detroit. However, after watching it, I've noticed that Detroit is getting some pretty significantly split reviews. Some of the professional critics are hailing it as one of the absolute best movies that's been released in 2017, such as Richard Roeper. And then the audience critical response is very split. So there's some universal positives, and they're ones you typically see in a movie made by Kathryn Bigelow. So some of those are gritty realism and tackling important subject matter. And some of the common negatives that seem to be repeatedly popping up is that it's too long and the narrative kind of loses its track. It isn't factual enough. So there are a lot of people who are nitpicking what happened in history and picking out ways that they think certain scenes or certain issues should have been tackled, which were maybe a little too fictionalized in the movie. There are also too many characters, and they have too little character development. So those aren't necessarily my opinions. Those are the ones that are coming up repeatedly from all of the people writing reviews on sites like IMDb. And then you have author M_exchange, who has personally directed a lot of short films, so he knows what should be cut out of a movie, and he says that there's way too much going on in this film. So just to kind of go into the analytical side of the movie Detroit, there are some scenes that are excellently done in this movie, perhaps even to a Best Picture caliber of scene. One of those is Boyega's interrogation scene, which was excellent, but I felt like it was far too brief. I wanted more of that scene. It only seemed to have lasted about 2 minutes. I really would have liked to see that expanded, to see a longer exchange, because he was doing a great job of looking distressed, looking nervous, shaking, not knowing what's going on. Additionally, the courtroom scene is very well done. It's very suspenseful. We get to see how the attorneys broke down the arguments, and we see a very important representation of two important sides of society. You have the police on one side of the courtroom, and then you have a lot of black society on the other side of the courtroom, and we see the differences in reactions to these police officers facing justice for what they did. The opening of the film is getting a lot of criticism for just being random type of rioting scenes. And I do feel like there were a bit many of those rioting scenes, but they are important because we're really trying to depict chaos and disorder. In order to do that, there does need to be somewhat of an element of randomness behind it. We don't necessarily need a full, thorough explanation of every little rioting event. With that being said, some of it probably still could have been cut. And then, of course, the film's most important scene was the motel scene. This was excellently done, and this is kind of what the whole movie is centralized over. It feels very uneasy. It is perfectly paced. The motivations are clear, and you could really feel the hesitation and the internal dilemma of the more minor characters, such as the National Guardsman who is helping the Detroit Police Department. You see how he's conflicted with the situation, but he doesn't really want to go far enough to publicly go against them. So there's a lot of little innate motivations going on in that scene, as well as the horrific actions, which make that scene excellent. And if any scene was going to be done right, that's the scene that really needed to be for this film to work. As far as the characters go, John Boyega's character was interesting, and he brought up some good questions. He even speaks to what it's like to be a black man in power, conflicted with the situation. He has a good internal struggle that we see all the way before the motel incident, during the motel incident, and even in the courtroom when he is kind of treading that line between being with the police and being with the people who are getting abused by the police. Larry was far too simplified of a character, in my opinion. He didn't become very dynamic until after the trauma he experienced at the motel. Up until that point, he seemed very oversimplified, very confident, very kind of egocentric. He just wasn't a particularly interesting character to me, despite his tie-in with the whole Motown fame that would come in the future. Fred, Larry's friend, was essentially completely undeveloped. He is kind of following Larry around throughout the movie. He's close friends with him, but he doesn't talk very much, and he's kind of resistant to a lot of the things Larry is doing. It's very difficult to get invested with Fred at all. I felt like Fred could have really used some important character building scenes because it was very difficult to identify with anything Fred was doing. Will Poulter's depiction of the dirty cop was very well done, and he exercised his philosophy convincingly. The film would not work without this character. This was one of the best performances of the film. He really makes the audience despise him, and you really do believe that he believes in what he is doing. He believes he is playing a vital role in cleaning up Detroit, despite him being horribly racist and essentially abusing his prisoners. But you can tell that the character really is authentic in what he is doing. The philosophy of the film is perhaps one of the most important things to talk about. So what led to these situations? Can we infer what built up to these situations? This is criticism that a lot of people are putting on this film, is that we watch the situation unfold and we watch characters experience it, but we don't really talk about what led up to it. We don't talk about the circumstances and the way situations were handled. So that's an important question that we should ask ourselves when we watch this movie. Few people are mentioning the use of the National Guard. In the beginning, they were responding very militarily, and they were escalating situations. There's a very brief scene where a young girl moves the blinds to the side to see what's going on the street, and one of the National Guardsmen sees that and calls out sniper, and they completely open fire on the window. It's a perfect example of how military involvement in a civil situation can be very problematic, and I feel like this isn't really being discussed in a lot of the reviews and analyses that I've read. The police were created as a dichotomy. It seemed as though the main dirty cop was allowed to continue working despite his bias.
It's a war zone out there. They're destroying the city.
This theme is continued with the state police saying that they don't want involvement in a civil rights case, despite somebody telling them that Detroit police are kind of losing their minds in there. This is also continued further into the trial when the police go free. So ethical oversight is the ultimate theme of this film. Those willing to do good, such as John Boyega's character and the National Guardsmen in the motel, were not willing to act strongly enough to actually stop the situation. They preferred to just slightly influence the situation and try to get people out of it as the film progressed. So this could be seen as kind of a cost to that. The lack of ethical oversight is enabling these people in power to create situations like this. So that's a very interesting philosophical idea to think about with this film. Overall, this is a great quality movie. It's definitely in the top tier of the year, but it isn't the best. It has pacing and character issues. Zero Dark 30 and The Hurt Locker were able to focus and hone in on one protagonist, and the difference is felt in Detroit. However, these themes are immensely detailed, and there's a lot of internal struggle that really makes this movie worth watching. So those are some thoughts on the movie of Detroit. I found it interesting that the split is really coming from a lot of factual issues, despite that a lot of these things seem like they're not even known for sure, especially what happened within the motel. The movie claims it was based off of testimonies from some people that were there, but a lot of critics, a lot of reviews are claiming that it's just not depicted the way that they would have wanted. And there's that whole dynamic of not talking about what led to the situation. So what do you guys think about that? How do you think this film did justice to the Detroit riots? Let us know in the comments, and please consider subscribing if you like these types of videos.